Does it? All right, we are live. And today is the first in a new series called FUD with Friends. And the whole concept of FUD with Friends is we're going to come up with what we think are really interesting kind of narratives and things that have been buzzing around in the cryptoverse, crypto universe, maybe not to steal from Ben. But anyways, the idea here is to have some experts and thought leaders on different topics come in and share kind of their insights on what we're talking about. Today is the very first episode. We're talking about intent centricity and what that means to Web3, to development, to users, and so on. We've got a good friend of mine, Patrick, that's here to help us all about it, or help us learn a little bit more about it. But first, a little video. All right, Patrick, my friend, you've been on the pod many times. Thank you a ton for joining us again. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Maybe for the people that haven't seen you yet on any one of the episodes, can you want to give like a quick little background before we kind of dig into the topic for today?
Yeah, so I have an academic background, PhD economist, did my PhD at UCLA at the business school, taught MBAs and MFEs. For a little while, then went and worked as a quant, actually worked at a startup that a friend of mine started. And while I was there, I kind of helped him build a lot of the software infrastructure he needed. And so I really became passionate about this intersection between financial modeling and software development. And so from there, co-founded Arrow Markets, working on building a lot of different things. JD and I talk about kind of some of the opportunities in the space pretty regularly. And so, yeah, based on kind of my experience building out this type of technology, I wrote some Substack articles related to hybrid systems and intent-centric systems. And so here we are. Amazing. All right. For anybody that has been paying attention to the news or the buzz in crypto for the last little while, intent-centric has been one of those buzzwords that I think a lot of groups have used. So I'm going to show a few articles just quickly to kind of set the stage, and then we're going to double click and deep dive on it a little bit. So the first article is actually from the Daily Huddle. And this article talks specifically about Orbs and its perpetual hub. But essentially, to summarize, they're talking a lot about the user experience aspects of intent-centric activities. It's a buzzword, and often I feel like we only have a fairly superficial kind of understanding. What they're trying to do, or what they're suggesting that they're doing, is they're using advanced tools to boost their TVL and user activities. And essentially what they're trying to do is build workflows based on what they think the user intends to accomplish. The next one, similar concept, is from Cointelegraph. Essentially, the title of the article, if you want to switch to the next one, Mickey, the title of the article is DAppOS secures $15.3 million to simplify Web3 interaction. Now, DAppOS has been speaking about intent-centric structures for some time, a couple of years at least. I've been on a few of their Binance Lives and podcasts talking about this very thing. And I think DAppOS explains it, and this article explains it fairly nicely from the perspective of, again, the user experience. It's kind of the first half of the equation. It talks a lot about trying to simplify things in such a way that the user has very, very few steps to accomplish what they're trying to, which is obviously pretty exciting. DAppOS making some great strides, of course. The next article is from Crypto Daily, and it talks about Particle Network, which is using essentially some ZK technology, zero knowledge technology, to build what they call an intent fusion protocol. I think this one is starting to get a little bit more technical in terms of how it's explaining intent centricity and what that means, from an architecture or workflow planning perspective. Essentially, what they're trying to do is trying to simplify
building with this kind of modality in mind for new developers, people, companies, protocols new to the space. They're trying to build kind of the Lego blocks for that. And lastly, an article, and I'm actually going to read a little bit of this one, but the summary of this article from, where was this one from? CoinDesk, was essentially the concept of intents is emerging as a transformative approach in blockchain technology, aiming to simplify and enhance user interactions. An intent refers to a specific goal that a user wants to achieve on the blockchain, such as trading or transferring assets. But instead of providing detailed instructions, users state their goals, and then third-party solvers, either people, bots, or protocols, handle the pathways of execution. I think, again, kind of just highlighting my summary of most of the articles and most of the discussions that I've seen in the last couple of years around this, it talks a lot about trying to meet the user where they're currently at in terms of their understanding and what they're trying to accomplish, while abstracting complexity, where I think as a space and where most articles and most discussions fall a little bit short is what is the other side of that equation? What happens below the surface, and what are the architecture and design decisions on the protocols and the technologies themselves? And so, Patrick, my friend, I know this is a lot of me talking here, but Patrick wrote an incredible Substack on intents and hybrid systems in Web3. And so I'm not going to steal too much of your thunder, Patrick. I'm just going to do a quick little introduction. But essentially, it's talking, or what Patrick was highlighting here is how there's kind of this concept of hybrid systems that are really kind of coupling with traditional technologies and traditional infrastructures to reduce costs and actually make Web3 a 1 and 1 is 3 type innovation. I'm not going to go to too many details, but Patrick, maybe before we get going, what got you excited to write about this? I know we talk about this a lot, and you've been thinking about it for quite some time. But what made you want to kind of dive a bit deeper on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to your point, I think I originally came to this a little more from the back end side, and I think a lot of people who are talking about intents and intent-centric systems are thinking about it from the user side. But at Era Markets, we fundamentally had to build a hybrid system, building that made me think about what a lot of these kind of choices are about. What components to put on chain, what components to keep off chain, and to delegate to a specialized resource. So I think in terms of some of the language that was being used in some of the articles you referenced, these third-party solvers that they're referring to, these are resources other than kind of the base layer where the application is deployed. So intents fundamentally, implementations of intent-centric systems are fundamentally hybrid systems. And so that's where my interest, I kind of backed into my interest in intent systems based on some of these architecture design choices that you have to make on the back end. So that's where I came. That's how I came to it.
Awesome. I think obviously I'm excited to kind of dive in, but maybe we can kind of set the stage a little bit, at least from your article, and we'll post the link to the article underneath the video and so on. And if you want to check Patrick out, obviously OX Proteon on Twitter, and you can search for his Substack and so on as well. Nonetheless, could you maybe start with just explaining kind of from your perspective, what is an intent to begin with? Let's just maybe start there.
Yeah, so I think it is right to think of intents from the user standpoint. So there was a great early paradigm article about intents that made this distinction between declarative versus imperative. And from the user standpoint, an intent-centric system lets them specify orders in a declarative way instead of an imperative way, which means they can remain agnostic to the particular execution paths. They just kind of broadly put up the terms of the transaction. So, I want to spend this much and I want this much in return. That's declarative. And then imperative, if I want to do this all through Uniswap or something, then imperative is going to be the components of the order that specify, exactly which paths I use in terms of implementing a swap, for example, and it kind of doesn't leave any components of the order to resources other than the base chain. So I do think that is kind of the right way to think about intense centric systems. Is from the user standpoint, it's a way for them to abstract from a lot of the technical details and just enter kind of their broad preferences in terms of the parameters of the transaction.
Maybe to rephrase that from kind of my smooth brain perspective. But essentially what's happening is, and we talk about this a lot. I mean, what we're trying to build technologies now, either consciously or subconsciously, that says the user has something they're trying to accomplish, but they probably don't care how it gets accomplished, where it goes, who it routes through, as long as there's some principles of trust there. They're not really concerned about what route it takes or where it goes or what exchange it uses or what blockchain it settles on, as long as they get the intended result. Is that kind of correct, Patrick?
I mean, I think that is kind of a way to think about it from the user standpoint. Again, I kind of came at it from the back-end architecture standpoint. And from that standpoint, the emphasis is a little different, and we can get into that. It's more related to kind of how you build these hybrid systems. But yeah, I think the broad definition of intent's kind of the place to start is this user-based definition that allows the user to abstract from a lot of kind of the technical details in terms of how their transaction gets implemented, and just be as broad as possible in terms of specifying their preferences.
Okay, so I mean, something, I guess other things that you and I have talked about quite a bit is kind of that interplay between centralized and decentralized, and we've spent a long time debating both publicly and privately, well, really how these TradFi and Web2 type businesses, are they going to support Web3 and have some like contact surface, or is Web3 intended to just replace kind of your TradFi structures and so on? And you have a really interesting take on this. Maybe you could explain kind of your thought on contact surface and so on, and how maybe as a philosophy, decentralization at all costs might not be the optimal outcome. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, and I've written about this before as well, much earlier. I think the path to the way that this technology, the Web3 technology, becomes integrated at a larger and larger scale is through some of these more nuanced integrations that involve components of off-chain and components of on-chain resources. And that can be either from a purely technological standpoint, or even through some of the regulatory institutions that, you have an option to kind of bypass a lot of those if you're building everything directly on Web3, but you might not always want to bypass all of them. And so I think, if we look to the future, that's what success for this technology looks like, is integration with some of these, with existing infrastructure along multiple dimensions, institutions and technology. I think here for intense, I think all of the intense centric systems that we've talked about fundamentally are hybrid systems from a technological standpoint. So they fundamentally have multiple components. One component is on-chain, fully on-chain. And then there is some other dedicated or specialized resource that makes the workflow, that makes the experience better for users. So that resource can be a separate layer 2. It can be a custom virtual machine. It could also just be servers run by the project, right? It really just depends on kind of what the needs are for the particular circuit. So the way that these intent-centric systems are built, the ones that I've seen, fundamentally use this hybrid structure and exploit, like you said, this contact surface between what's on-chain and what's off-chain. And I really think that this extra dimension is something that we're only beginning to explore, because there was quite a bit of pressure early on for a lot of these applications to be fully decentralized, but then there are a lot of limitations, particularly from the user standpoint, from a user experience standpoint, of doing everything on chain like that. And so then you get this preference for intense-based systems and so forth. And these are implemented by exploiting this contact surface between the on and off chain resources. And by the way, I think what we'll see is these dedicated resources can become more and more specialized, and also they can be decentralized or trustless to varying degrees, right? It's kind of an application specific question. If you want to build some specialized logic away from the base chain, how trustless do you need that component of the logic to be as well, right? You can calibrate that. So I think we're going to see more and more specialization and more exploitation of this contact surface between the on and off chain resources.
So kind of repackaging that again in my smooth brain ways, I think coming back to the user, let's say that I'm a user and I want to swap some asset and I expect to get at least X number of tokens in return, whatever the secondary asset is. When I come to a protocol that might be focused on intent centricity, all I really care about is that once I communicate my intent to you, that you find the best way to achieve that. Now, there's something really important there, the trust assumptions. And obviously, you're making some fairly strong trust assumptions. And I know that maybe from the perspective, some examples that you used in the article was Flashbots and JITO. And maybe we can talk about their hybrid systems. But first, can you kind of unpack a little bit what the trust assumptions are here and why that's so critical in mechanism design?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Flashbots and JITO those are very interesting cases of hybrid systems. In the case of Flashbots, I'm not sure how to kind of pack that into an intent-centric kind of, framing. I think with JITO, you might be able to. I'd have to think a little more about it. But in general, you have to make some assumptions about what type of trust the user is expecting in terms of the ability of these alternative resources to perform whatever function you need them to perform for the circuit. And that can be assessed kind of on a case-by-case basis. I will say there's a very important ingredient here, which is in order to kind of carve out different components of a workflow to the base layer and to an alternative resource, you have to be able to kind of modularize the trust assumption for that component of the workflow. You have to be able to completely isolate these workflows, right? So you could think there might be limiting cases where a particular application, the workflow is so simple that there are no independent parts that you could break up and move different pieces to different resources. So there is this fundamental assumption. Let me give you an example. At Aero Markets, what happens entirely on the base layer is the settlement of the option. So when the option settles, the settlement computations, the settlement price, the amount of proceeds that are made available to the option owners, the liabilities for the option sellers, and so forth, all of those are determined completely on chain. Whereas the real-time option prices are determined in an alternative resource, right? The alternative resource leans on a lot of the specialist infrastructure that already exists for market makers, for being able to hedge exposure to options portfolios and so forth. And so if we couldn't completely disconnect those two components of the workflows, it wouldn't make sense to talk about modularizing these pieces. So that's just kind of an example. You asked me, I think, to dig in a little bit to how this modularization works in practice. I think fundamentally you have to be able to split the workflows into these independent components. But if you can do that, you can kind of assess what the needs are for trust. You can trade off trust versus specialization for each of those modules.
So in the Aero example that you gave, some things obviously can simply be encompassed in the smart contract calculations and different things. But there are some components of that operation that in some cases live off-chain or live at a different venue of some sort. And so essentially what you're saying is the user in the Aero Markets circumstance, as long as they trust whatever process you're using to get those off-chain components, the drive and desire to have everything on-chain is somewhat moot. Is that correct?
That's right. But I think we can even be a little more specific than that. We can say, how much does the user value each unit of trust versus how much does the user value each unit of price quality, for example. So, we could put everything on chain, but then the user would have to tolerate, much worse prices, much slower operation. The execution prices would be much, much worse, right? So there's this question of, yes, we have to ask what trust assumption is the user looking for each of these modules. But but what's the reason we're building these different modules? It's because trust and performance trade off in different ways for different modules. So you have to know kind of what that trade-off is at the level of the module. And at Era Markets, look, the problem that hadn't been solved in crypto options was giving good prices to users for illiquid instruments. And by moving this component to an alternative resource, we can solve that problem. So it's really just about this trade-off. How much do you value each kind of marginal unit of trust versus marginal unit of performance?
Yeah, so I mean, when you're making those kind of design decisions in building a protocol, you have to say, hey, it is in pursuing absolute decentralization, am I detracting from the ultimate goal of what the application was really trying to accomplish? Are we doing ourselves a service and making 1 and 1 3? Or are we actually impeding ourselves or handicapping ourselves by forcing something on chain that is actually not necessary to be there? Is that kind of
exactly? But the criteria should be what the user wants, right? I mean, that's what we should be thinking. How is the user trading off trust and performance?
Right.
Yep. And for some of these workflows, the user does prefer more performance than you can get if you delegate the trust entirely to the base layer.
Amazing. Okay, so I know you used, or you talked a little bit about convergence RFQ, the protocol liquidity on Solana that uses an intense-based architecture. Do you want to kind of dive into that a little bit? What does convergence do, and how does this kind of embody the idea here of modularity and intent centricity?
Yeah, I mean, I think convergence is another great example of how to use intents. I don't want to go too much into the details. I should say this paper that we're referencing on Substack is co-authored with Ube, who's the founder of Convergence RFQ on Solana, and also Cameron. And so both of them, may be good candidates for people to have on the pod and talk about some of this stuff in the future. So I think I'll defer mostly to Ube in terms of the details of the RFQ circuit, but fundamentally the idea that Ube, I know, embraces in terms of using intents on convergence is to simplify the experience tremendously for the user. And I mean, you can have kind of paths on convergence. You can have paths where there are multiple different executions in a sequence, but from the user's standpoint, it's just one initial intent that they express. So I know he comes at this from a very user experience focused framework, and it might be a good idea to have him on and chat about it a little more in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. He'd be a great guest. Okay, so I think we've got a pretty good understanding of kind of what intent centricity means. I think, again, as I kind of mentioned before, I think a lot of the PR articles and a lot of the kind of narrative around this right now is focused very heavily on the first part of the equation. That is just assessing the intent of the user and how that's relevant. And then where the actual magic is in many cases is kind of translating that into something practical and something that you can deploy. The more that we've talked about this, Patrick, I think it kind of expands the paradigm in terms of speed to adoption. The innovative cycles can be a lot quicker, so on and so forth. Kind of, what are your thoughts? What are the implications of this on the future?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more applications that are kind of more modularized like this. So we'll see applications that have multiple different components needed to execute a particular workflow, where these components are implemented on specialized resources. And so I think we're already seeing we're obviously seeing a proliferation of L2s. I think pretty soon we'll probably start seeing a proliferation of more bespoke virtual machines on a lot of these layers. And so I think applications are going to be able to kind of break apart their workflows into independent components where assumptions about the trade-off between trust and performance can be assessed independently, and then each of them will be deployed on some specialized infrastructure. So I think we'll see kind of a proliferation of this specialization, and all of this is good for the users, right? All of this means transaction complexity goes down, transaction speed goes up, right? Efficiency goes up on multiple dimensions. So I think that's the direction we're headed.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty exciting, I think, to think about what some of the solutions, and again, I kind of overuse this word a little bit, modularity, but that's one of the things that we're really starting to think about in this kind of ultimate composable environment that we're all trying to kind of build towards is, do we need to create all things, or is there really, really good ways to find very effective and efficient tools that we can just build into our workflows? And that allows that innovation cycle to really pick up velocity. When you're thinking about, when you hear about these kind of intent-centric focused projects, and when you're looking, and I know you guys do a lot of investment and so on, and angels and advising and stuff. When you're looking at projects that are talking about this, what are some of the questions that you think are critical to consider to figure out if they're using a buzzword or if they're actually building with that as a core focus?
That's a tough question. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think most of the times I've seen the term intents used, it's maybe a little bit embellished. It's kind of used to maybe make something seem a little, more thoughtful than it is. Fundamentally, these are just implementations of hybrid circuits. But I do think so. I would just kind of be on the lookout for overuse of that type of word, intent-centric. On the other hand, if someone is saying they're building something that's intent-centric, it probably means that they're making some of these trade-offs about trust and performance for some aspect of their application workflow. And if they're making that decision, it's because that delivers some efficiency to their users that it wouldn't if they weren't doing that. And so I think, on the one hand, you have to watch out for overuse of buzzwords. On the other hand, usually under the hood, if someone is saying they're doing something intent-centric, under the hood, they're actually doing something meaningful that does generate a new efficiency relative to just deploying the entire thing on the base layer.
Amazing. I'm obviously a big fan. We talk a lot about kind of what is going to bring the next 100 million, 200 million, 500 million users into this space. And I think, expecting people to overcome the friction of participating on blockchain and the complexity of these workflows as more and more protocols and layer twos and all of these other infrastructure pieces and different wallets and this and that really expand at a fairly incredible rate. It's becoming more and more complex for people. And so with a focus on intent centricity, I think that's going to help us bridge the gap, so to speak, in terms of abstracting so much of that complexity away.
Exciting. I mean, it pushes us, sorry to jump in, it pushes us in the right direction. You made this great point that I wanted to follow up on about, using existing resources. So the way these hybrid systems work, if you're able to modularize, a few different components of your workflow, and you want to allocate some aspects of your workflow to a resource other than the base layer, you can build a customized resource, but you can also just tap into existing infrastructure. And I think that's a point you were making that's really important here. It doesn't, when we're looking to the future and we're looking to see kind of where do we expect the proliferation, I do expect to see more kind of modularization of these components, but it doesn't necessarily have to be to kind of newly designed specialized resources. It can just be also to some existing resource that performs a function better than the base layer. And there are a lot of those resources. So I think we can see proliferation in that along that dimension is also going to be really important, to your point.
Well, and it's, something that there's a lot of debate about this in the space right now. Do we make like a super app where it's one app, one team that builds all of this bespoke novel, technology, or are we better off as a space to let the people that have niche expertise, let them build the venues for some of this stuff, and instead it creates a new business model for them, and it allows us to defer to the actual kind of tip of the spear experts on these types of things, as opposed to trying to do everything ourselves. How do you think that changes kind of the scope or the scale potential of applications and expansion of the space here going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's good for applications. I think applications that can use these hybrid tools to deliver better performance to their users, it's going to be great for applications. It might mean that it's not as great for base layers or any of these kind of custom VM resources. That space might become more and more competitive. But I think for the applications that the kind of the user-facing applications, I think it's great news. And I think if people keep pushing along this dimension, we're going to see a lot of improvements in terms of user experience for hybrid Web3 applications.
Amazing. All right, brother. Well, I really appreciate your thought leadership on this. Obviously, I have the pleasure and luxury of chatting through these things with you on a fairly regular basis, but I'm glad we could bring it and hopefully simplify it a little bit for our users. If people want to follow you and get more of your insight on these kind of deep dives, some of the deep dives you do on these really interesting topics, where can they find you?
Yeah, go to my Twitter, 0xprotean, and go to my Substack, Patrick Kiefer at Substack.
Easy peasy. Substacks are great. Your publishing cadence is usually once a month?
It fluctuates tremendously. I can do a few a month, and then sometimes not for a couple months. It depends on what else I'm working on. Usually depends on kind of what I'm thinking about, but as frequently as I can.
Maybe we'll get the FUD family to pressure you into more frequent Substacks. But anyways, Patrick, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's a very deep topic that we tried to cover as best we could in the next little bit. So for all of you that are watching, like, share, subscribe. We're going to do more of these FUD with Friends with a specific topic and thought leaders every second Friday for now. And of course, if people love the show and are keen to continue supporting, we can always look at doing it more frequently. If you have any ideas for deep dives or people, topics that you'd like to have us or like us to have on, please let us know. And yeah, I think we'll see y'all on Monday. Patrick, thanks a whole ton. And finally, on Friday, go FUD yourself.
With that, I have to say, go FUD yourself.
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 Go FUD yourself.